Hello and welcome. As you settle in tonight, imagine waking up not in your cozy bed, but in a world without any of your modern comforts. Could you last a single day in ancient England? Let's find out together as we gently journey through a history so fascinatingly mundane, it might just lull you to sleep. If this quiet exploration helps you drift off, please like this video and subscribe for more calming stories. The last thing you remembered was the soft hum of your air purifier, the faint glow of your phone screen casting shifting shadows on your modern ceiling, and the comforting weight of your high thread count duvet. You were nestled in the familiar cocoon of your own bed, in your own quiet home. Perhaps a whisper of a podcast fading into the edges of your consciousness. The air was regulated, the sounds muted, the world outside a distant, controllable hum. You were safe, comfortable, undeniably modern. And then, with an abruptness that stole your breath and slammed into your senses, it was gone. You gasped, a dry, ragged sound that caught in a throat suddenly parched. Your eyes, accustomed to the soft, diffused light of street lamps filtering through blinds, struggled against a profound, absolute darkness. It wasn't the darkness of a blackout or a moonless night. This was a visceral, suffocating blackness, a void so complete it pressed in on your eyeballs, tasting metallic and thick, devoid of any discernible shape or form. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of your awareness, like tiny, agitated insects crawling just beneath your skin. You instinctively reached out, expecting the smooth, cool fabric of your pillowcase. Instead, your fingers met something coarse, rough, and strangely stiff. It felt like densely packed hay or straw, poking uncomfortably against your skin, a sensation utterly alien to your accustomed softness. You tried to shift, to sit up, but your body felt oddly constrained, tangled in something that was definitely not your duvet. It was heavy, scratchy, and smelled different. Not just different in a pleasant, unfamiliar way, but in a raw, earthy, and frankly, unpleasant way. A cacophony of new smells assaulted your nose, an overwhelming assault that made your stomach clench. The dominant note was a pervasive, cloying scent of smoke, not the clean, filtered scent from a fireplace, but a thick, acrid, woodsy smoke, heavy with the dampness of an inefficient burn. Underneath that, there was the sharp, undeniable tang of animal waste. A strong, musky odor of livestock, perhaps just a few feet away. And then, woven into this tapestry of unpleasantness, was the faint, sickly sweet decay of unprocessed refuse, the pungent aroma of human bodies unwashed, and a damp, earthy smell that was either stale mud or decaying thatch. It was a smell that burrowed deep into your nostrils, clinging with a tenacity that promised to never leave, no matter how many times you breathed. Your modern senses, so accustomed to sanitized environments, recoiled violently. You found yourself gagging, a dry, empty heave that echoed strangely in the claustrophobic space. Then came the sounds. The darkness, which you'd initially thought was silent, began to fill with a subtle, disquieting symphony. There was the rustle of straw beneath you, a dry, whispering sound as you shifted. From somewhere nearby, a soft, rhythmic snoring began, deep and resonant, punctuated by what sounded like a sniffle or a cough. Further away, perhaps just outside the hovel's flimsy walls, you could hear the low, contented grunting of a pig, or the soft, intermittent bleating of a sheep, and through it all, a constant, almost imperceptible scratching sound, a skittering that sent a cold shiver down your spine. Mice, perhaps, or something larger? The silence you craved was utterly absent, replaced by a symphony of unfamiliar, unsettling noises. You tried to speak, to call out, Your voice a strangled whisper. Hello? Where? Where am I? The words felt thick and clumsy on your tongue, coated with a strange dry film. No answer came, only the continued rustling and the soft, steady breathing of the unseen forms around you. The cold began to seep into your bones, a damp, pervasive chill that your inadequate covering did little to repel. It was a kind of cold that was in the air, not just on your skin, seeping into the very fabric of your being. As your eyes slowly, painfully, began to adjust to the profound absence of light, faint shapes started to coalesce. You were indeed lying on a bed of straw, covered by a rough, scratchy woolen blanket that smelled faintly of sheep and smoke. Around you, you could just make out the vague outlines of other forms, huddled together, their breathing a steady, low rhythm. You realized with a jolt of pure horror that you were in a communal sleeping space, and the rough, uneven ground beneath you, the sense of being on a dirt floor, confirmed your growing dread. This was not your home. This was not your time. A faint, almost imperceptible sliver of gray light began to appear, not from a window, but from a small, irregular opening high up on what you presumed was the wall, a crude hole that served as a chimney or a vent. As the sky outside gradually lightened, that sliver of light expanded, allowing you to finally perceive your surroundings. You were in a small, single-room dwelling. The walls were made of wattle and daub, interwoven wooden stakes plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, and dung. The roof, low and heavy, was of thick, compacted thatch, dark and rough. There was no furniture beyond what appeared to be a crude, wooden chest in one corner, and perhaps a small, wobbly stool near what you now identified as a hearth in the center of the room, a perpetually smoking fire pit, from which the acrid smell originated, still held a few dying embers. There were no distinct rooms, no privacy, no clean surfaces. The floor was simply packed earth, uneven and hard beneath the thin layer of straw that served as your bed. The figures around you began to stir. You could now see them more clearly in the dim light. They were peasants, their faces etched with lines of toil and weariness, even in sleep. Their clothes were simple, coarse tunics and breeches made of undyed wool or linen, patched and worn. Their hair was matted, their skin grimy. This was the family you had, somehow, found yourself amongst. A stoic-looking man with calloused hands, a woman whose face was perpetually tired but kind, and several small children, still huddled together for warmth. You recognized, with a chilling certainty, that your own clothing was now similarly rough, itchy, and ill-fitting. Your soft, modern skin already felt raw against the coarse fabric. The first rays of true daylight, filtered and weak, finally pierced the smoky interior. They illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, the unevenness of the walls, and the dull, muted colors of your new existence. There was no glamour, no romanticism to this. This was simply raw, unvarnished survival. The man of the house groaned, a deep, guttural sound, and slowly pushed himself up. His movements were stiff, his joints creaking audibly. He coughed, a dry, rattling cough that seemed to vibrate through the small hovel. You watched him, paralyzed by a mixture of fear and profound disbelief. Your own body, still sore and stiff from this unfamiliar resting place, felt a wave of exhaustion already settling in, and the day had barely even begun. Then a quiet, almost resigned voice spoke, a voice that was clearly female and directed at you. It was heavily accented, the words rough and guttural, but undeniably English, though an archaic form you strained to comprehend. Rise, the sun is up, and the well awaits. The bucket is by the door. The words were simple, a command rather than a request, delivered without expectation of protest. You blinked, trying to process the instruction. The well? The bucket? You. who had only ever turned a tap for water or pressed a button on a coffee machine. With a profound sense of foreboding, you forced your protesting body to sit up. Every muscle ached. The straw pricked your skin through the coarse tunic. The pervasive chill clung to you. You swung your legs over the side of your straw pallet, and your bare feet met the cold, hard-packed earth floor. It was damp beneath your toes, gritty and uneven. You shivered involuntarily. You spotted the bucket, a heavy wooden thing, crudely made, resting by the low, rough wooden door. It looked enormous, unwieldy. The thought of filling it, carrying it, was already daunting. Your modern mind screamed in protest. Your muscles, accustomed to a gentle morning stretch or the weight of a smartphone, felt completely inadequate. As the woman of the house began to stir a small, dying fire in the hearth, sending up a fresh plume of acrid smoke, you knew, with a chilling, absolute certainty, that your carefully constructed, technologically advanced, hygienically pristine life was gone. You were here, in a medieval peasant's hovel, and the first task of your new, unbelievably arduous day was simply to fetch water. Well, this wasn't a historical documentary watched from the comfort of your couch. This was raw, immediate, and overwhelmingly real. The sheer scale of the change, the sudden, total stripping away of every modern convenience, every expectation of comfort, every guarantee of safety, settled upon you like the heavy, smoky air in the hovel. The profound, exhausting reality of simply being here, of breathing this air, of smelling these smells, of feeling this constant, pervasive discomfort, began to seep into your bones. The gentle sounds of the awakening hovel, the soft coughs, the rustling straw, the distant animal sounds, began to blur into a dull, monotonous hum, pulling at the edges of your consciousness, a deep, pervasive weariness already settling in, the well-awaited, and you knew, with a crushing certainty, that you wouldn't last a day. The command to rise, delivered in that strange, guttural accent, hung in the smoky air. Your body, already stiff and protesting from the rough straw, reluctantly began to respond. As you pushed yourself up, a wave of dizziness washed over you, likely from the stagnant, smoky air you'd been breathing all night. Your eyes, still adjusting, blinked against the dim light filtering through the hovel's single, crude opening. The woman of the house, whom you now saw more clearly as a figure draped in simple, dark wool, moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of countless repetitions. She knelt by the central hearth, carefully coaxing the dying embers back to life with a few dry twigs, sending up fresh curls of acrid smoke that made your eyes water and your throat constrict. The air never seemed to clear. It was a perpetual haze of wood smoke, mingling with the other, less pleasant, ambient odors of the hovel. Your first conscious thought, beyond the raw discomfort, turned to hygiene. In your modern life, this was an almost unconscious series of actions. A warm shower, scented soap, a clean towel, a soft toothbrush, minty toothpaste, perhaps a touch of deodorant. Here, the brutal reality of medieval bathing, or the distinct lack thereof, slammed into you. There was no running water, of course. No tap. No basin. No clean porcelain. The bucket you were meant to fetch water with was for drinking and cooking, not for leisurely washing. You looked around for anything resembling a washcloth or soap. There was nothing. The best you could hope for, you quickly realized, was a quick splash of the communal well water when it arrived, to your face and hands, if you were lucky enough to have enough to spare. The idea of truly cleaning yourself, of removing the layers of grime, sweat, and the pervasive odor of smoke and earth that already clung to your skin and hair, seemed utterly impossible. You became acutely aware of your mouth. Your tongue felt thick, your teeth gritty. The sweet, Clean freshness of toothpaste was a distant, mocking memory. Here, people might chew on twigs or herbs to freshen their breath, but a true dental routine was unimaginable. You ran your tongue over your teeth, feeling the unpleasant coating, and suppressed a shudder. This was a constant, low-level discomfort you would have to learn to live with. The pervasive smell that had greeted you upon waking was now your own. Your rough woolen tunic, which felt scratchier with every movement, absorbed the hovel's atmosphere. You already smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and an underlying faint human musk. The thought of what your hair, thick and unwashed, must feel and smell like was a small, quiet horror. You ran a tentative hand through it, finding it matted and stiff. This, you understood, was your new normal. You wouldn't just be smelling the Middle Ages. You would be the Middle Ages, physically embodying its pervasive sense. As the fire crackled to life, casting flickering orange light on the packed earth floor, the family began to stir more fully. The man of the house, your supposed father or guardian, grunted again and began to rub his stiff joints. The children, small bundles of wool and matted hair, began to whimper softly, probably from hunger. There was no easy, instant breakfast here. No quick toast, no ready-to-eat cereal, no coffee brewing automatically. Breakfast was a monotonous affair, defined by scarcity and simplicity. The woman produced a dark, hard loaf of stale bread from a rough cloth bag. It was dense, made from coarse grain, and looked incredibly unappetizing. She tore off pieces, handing them around. You received a chunk, heavy and unyielding in your hand. You bit into it, and your teeth struggled against its toughness. It tasted bland, earthy, and slightly sour, a stark contrast to the fluffy, enriched loaves you were used to. This was sustenance, not pleasure. Accompanying the bread was a bowl of pottage, a thick, watery gruel made from boiled grains, perhaps oats or barley. Sometimes with a few chopped wild greens, or a stray, small root vegetable if they were fortunate. It was warm, at least, but utterly devoid of flavor beyond the faint earthiness of the grains. There was no salt, no pepper, no butter, no sugar, just a bland, viscous liquid that was meant to fill your stomach, not tantalize your taste buds. You picked up the crude wooden spoon, watching the thin steam rise, and tried to swallow the lukewarm, tasteless concoction. Every bite was an effort, a conscious act of consumption rather than enjoyment. To drink, there was weak ale. Not water, for clean water was often scarce and unsafe, reserved for special uses. Ale, even weak ale, was safer as the brewing process killed off most pathogens. It was served in a communal wooden cup, passed around the family. The ale was thin, slightly sour, and lukewarm. It barely quenched your thirst, and certainly didn't offer the refreshing clarity of clean water or the invigorating kick of coffee. This was your daily hydration, your caloric supplement. The lack of variety, the sheer unchanging sameness of the food, was already a slow, creeping form of boredom that promised to extend endlessly into the future. After this meager meal came the dressing for the day. There wasn't much to it. You were already wearing your rough wool tunic and breeches, the very clothes you had presumably slept in. There were no fresh clothes, no change of underwear, no concept of clean garments for each day. People typically owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothing, worn until they literally fell apart. The fabric was coarse, the stitching rudimentary, itched constantly, a low, persistent irritation on your skin. You found yourself absent-mindedly scratching at your arms and legs. The weight of the clothing was surprisingly heavy, especially the wool, designed for warmth rather than comfort or style. There were no zippers, no buttons, beyond perhaps a few crude bone fasteners. Everything was tied, laced, or simply slipped on. The layers, though few, felt cumbersome. Your body felt bulky, restricted, unable to move with the same ease you were accustomed to. The lack of proper fit, the way the coarse fabric chafed, added to the pervasive sense of physical discomfort. As the morning light grew stronger, illuminating the hovel's interior more fully, it revealed the worn, patched nature of everyone's garments. Every piece of clothing was a testament to endless repair and reuse. This wasn't fashion, it was pure utility, designed to protect against the elements and nothing more. Finally, it was time to leave the hovel and head to the fields. The air outside was cold and damp, especially at this early hour. Your feet, still bare on the muddy ground outside the door, protested immediately. There were no comfortable shoes, no waterproof boots. Perhaps a pair of simple leather turn shoes if you were lucky, or just rags wrapped around your feet. The ground was uneven, often thick with mud, or littered with sharp stones and animal droppings. Every step was a conscious effort, a careful negotiation with the treacherous terrain. As you began the walk to the communal fields, you noticed the path. It wasn't paved, wasn't gravel. It was a well-worn track, beaten down by countless feet and animal hooves over generations, uneven and perpetually muddy in places, dusty in others. The walk was longer than you expected. Perhaps a mile or two, depending on which strip of land your family was assigned that day. The sheer effort of just getting to work, before any actual labor had begun, was already draining. Your calf muscles, accustomed to sidewalks and smooth floors, felt the strain. Around you, other villagers, equally silent and weary, were making their way to the fields. Their faces were grim, their movements slow and methodical. The distant sounds of livestock, the occasional call of a bird, and the soft squelch of mud underfoot were the only ambient noises. There was no cheerful morning music, no stimulating news updates, no easy conversation to distract from the growing sense of dread about the long, laborious day ahead. You realized, with a deep, unsettling clarity, that this was not a quick visit, a reenactment, or a historical tour. This was life. And every single moment of it, from the moment your eyes opened, was a relentless assault on your modern sensibilities. The constant discomfort, the lack of hygiene, the monotony of food, the arduous physical demands, the absence of any personal space or luxury, it all combined into a pervasive, grinding weariness that seemed to settle not just on your body, but deep within your spirit. The sheer exhaustion of simply existing in this world, without the crutches of modern convenience, was already overwhelming. As you trudged along the muddy path, the gray dawn slowly brightening into a dull morning, you knew, with a certainty that chilled you to the bone, that you wouldn't last a day. And the rhythmic squelch of mud beneath your feet, a steady cold wind on your face, and the distant monotonous bleating of sheep began to weave themselves into a dull, persistent drone, pulling your mind further and further into a quiet, heavy weariness, a prelude to the endless toil that awaited you. The walk to the fields was a deceptive prelude. Your muscles, still protesting the unusual stiffness from sleeping on straw, had barely begun to loosen when the first, daunting sight of the communal arable land stretched before you. It wasn't the neat, geometric, machine-tilled expanses of modern agriculture. This was a vast, undulating patchwork of long, narrow strips, each roughly an acre, interspersed with grassy balks that marked the boundaries between different families' holdings. The ground was dark, heavy earth, still damp with morning dew in places, or clinging mud from recent rain. And everywhere, there was the sense of an enormous, unyielding task awaiting. The air in the fields was different from the smoky confines of the hovel. Here, it was sharper, carrying the damp scent of soil and decaying vegetation, mingled with the earthy aroma of dung used as fertilizer. The sounds, too, shifted. The distant bleating of sheep, the lowing of cattle, and the constant rhythmic creak and groan of plows already at work in the far distance. These were the only machines you'd see here, and they were powered by animal and human might. You were immediately directed to your family's designated strip of land. The man of the house, with a curt gesture, handed you a hoe. It was not the light, ergonomically designed tool you might find in a modern garden center. This was a heavy, crudely forged iron blade attached to a thick, unpolished wooden handle. The weight of it, even just holding it, felt substantial, its balance awkward. The handle was rough, likely to splinter and rub your uncalloused hands raw within minutes. Its edge, though sharpened, looked dull against the sheer mass of the earth. Your task, you were told in that terse, unfamiliar dialect, was to help prepare the soil for sowing. This meant breaking up clods of earth left by the plow, clearing stones, and perhaps even creating shallow furrows for seeds. As you watched the man of the house demonstrate, his movements were slow, deliberate, and utterly tireless. He would swing the heavy hoe, driving the blade into the resistant earth, then pull back, turning over a lump of soil. Each movement was accompanied by a grunt of effort, a quiet exhalation. You mimicked his motion. The first swing felt clumsy, the hoe's weight pulling your arms down. The blade met the earth with a dull thud, barely scratching the surface. You tried again, putting more power into it, and the impact sent a jarring vibration up your arms and into your shoulders. The soil, far from breaking easily, resisted stubbornly. It was dense, packed by centuries of rain and footfall, intertwined with unseen roots. You quickly realized that even a simple movement like swinging a hoe required a very specific, deeply ingrained physical technique you utterly lacked. Within minutes, your back began to ache. The muscles in your shoulders, unaccustomed to this sustained, heavy effort, started to burn. A thin sheen of sweat broke out on your brow despite the cool morning air. Your hands, unused to gripping such rough wood, already felt tender, the skin beginning to chafe. You glanced around at the other peasants in the field. They moved with a slow, relentless rhythm, their bodies hunched, their faces impassive. They seemed to possess an endless reservoir of quiet endurance. There was no conversation, no cheerful banter, just the soft thud of hoes hitting earth, the occasional grunt, and the whisper of the wind through the tall, dry grasses on the box. The sun, having risen higher, now began to cast a more direct light. It wasn't warm enough to be pleasant, but it revealed the sheer scale of the task more clearly. Endless clods of earth, endless stones. Every square foot of ground demanded individual attention, individual force. Your progress was agonizingly slow. A few square feet, and you were already breathing heavily, your muscles screaming in protest. You tried to focus on the small section directly in front of you, breaking the overwhelming task into tiny, manageable increments. Just this one clod, just this next one. But the clods kept coming relentlessly, seemingly without end. Then came the elements. The high Middle Ages in England were not known for their mild, forgiving weather. One moment, a damp, biting wind would sweep across the open fields, chilling you to the bone, seeping through your thin, coarse tunic. The next, the sun, though weak, would beat down with an unexpected intensity, making you squint and feel the heat building beneath your heavy wool clothing. There was no shelter, no relief. You were utterly exposed to the whims of the sky. And the dirt. It was everywhere. It clung to your clothes, caked under your fingernails, worked its way into the itchy fabric of your tunic, and even, subtly, permeated your nostrils and mouth. You tasted it, felt its grittiness. Your hands, despite the cold, were perpetually damp with sweat and smeared with mud and soil. This wasn't the sterile dirt of a potted plant. This was raw earth, teeming with unseen life, filled with the remnants of centuries of human and animal activity. And then there were the insects. Tiny, insistent flies buzzed around your face, attracted by the sweat and the damp earth. Gnats danced in the weak sunlight, occasionally flying into your eyes or mouth. You swatted at them instinctively, but they were a persistent, unending annoyance, a constant low-level irritation that never truly went away. Your modern sensibilities, so used to insect repellents and screened windows, found this constant intrusion deeply unsettling, a tiny, relentless assault on your comfort. The pace of the work was soul-crushingly slow. There was no machinery, no combustion engine to speed things along. Every action was manual, every ounce of output a direct result of brute force and repetitive motion. The rhythm was dictated by the human body's capacity for sustained, agonizing effort. Thud, pull, thud, pull, over and over again. The hours stretched out, long and featureless. The sun was your only clock, slowly arcing across the sky, marking the passage of time in increments too vast for your modern, minute-conscious mind to grasp. You looked at the others, the true peasants, working beside you. They didn't complain. They didn't curse. They just worked. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes fixed on the ground before them. Their movements were economical, almost meditative in their repetition. They carried the weight of generations of toil in their very posture, their bowed shoulders, their strong, gnarled hands. You realized that this was their entire world, their entire existence. There was no escape, no alternative. This field, this hoe, this endless cycle of planting and harvesting, this was their destiny. The thought settled over you with a crushing weight. In your modern life, you had lunch breaks, coffee breaks, weekend plans, vacations. Here, there was only the work, interrupted only by the briefest of rests. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, but the mental exhaustion, the sheer monotony of it all, was even more profound. Your mind, accustomed to constant stimulation, to switching tasks, to finding novelty, felt dull and heavy. The landscape around you, initially alien, now seemed to stretch endlessly, featureless in its vastness, mirroring the unchanging horizon of your new existence. The silence, broken only by the sounds of labor and the elements, pressed in on you. There was no music in your ears, no podcast to distract you. Just the sound of your own labored breathing, the dull thud of the hoe, and the relentless, whispering wind. Your thoughts, initially racing with panic and disbelief, slowly began to slow down, weighed down by the sheer effort of the work. The distinct sounds of the field, the distant creak of the heavy plow, the soft squelch of mud, the drone of the flies, began to merge into a single, continuous, low hum. The individual discomforts, the aching back, the chafing hands, the stinging sweat in your eyes, became a persistent, dull ache, no longer sharp, but a constant, heavy presence. The relentless, slow pace of the work, the endless repetition, began to exert its own peculiar, heavy rhythm, like a slow, deliberate drumbeat pulling you deeper into a profound and quiet weariness, subtly preparing you for the inevitable descent into slumber. You dug, and the world seemed to narrow to the small, muddy patch before you, timeless and unchanging, drawing your consciousness into a state of quiet, heavy oblivion. The sun continued its slow, indifferent climb across the vast expanse of the medieval sky, offering little comfort or warmth. The relentless rhythm of the hoe in your hands had become a dull, monotonous thud, each strike sending a jolt of exhaustion through your protesting body. Your mind, though dulled by the physical labor, began to register a new layer of discomfort, a pervasive sense of vulnerability that hummed beneath the surface of the physical toil. You were not just working against the earth. You were working within a landscape teeming with dangers, both visible and invisible, that your modern life had utterly shielded you from. The most immediate and persistent threat, you quickly realized, came from wildlife and pests. While you toiled in the fields, your peripheral vision caught glimpses of movement. Small, dark shapes darted along the edges of the field. Mice and voles, constantly scuttling, their tiny lives intertwined with the very crops you were struggling to cultivate. They weren't just annoying, they were a direct threat to the meager harvest, constantly gnawing at newly sown seeds or stored grain, and where there were rodents, there were predators. The occasional hawk circled lazily overhead, a silent, watchful hunter. More unnerving were the sounds from the distant shadowed edges of the forest, the rustle of undergrowth, the snap of a twig. Tales, whispered in hushed tones around the evening fire, spoke of wolves that stalked the deep woods, their hungry eyes gleaming in the dark. Wild boars, notoriously aggressive and unpredictable, could savage a field or attack a person if provoked. You understood with a chilling clarity that stepping even a few yards off the well-worn path could mean a sudden, violent encounter with a creature far more formidable than anything you'd ever imagined outside of a zoo. Your modern world had tamed nature, pushed it back, confined it to reserves. Here, nature was untamed, unpredictable, and often lethally close. Your position on the lowest rung of the food chain felt starkly apparent. Beyond the wild animals, there were the ever-present, invisible pests that haunted every waking and sleeping moment. The persistent itch that had begun on your first night on the straw pallet had worsened. It was fleas, no doubt, tiny, agile creatures that lived in the straw of your bed, in the coarse wool of your clothes, and on the bodies of the animals often housed in the same dwelling. You could feel them, tiny pinpricks of irritation that moved across your skin, making you subtly, almost unconsciously, scratch. And then there were lice, insidious inhabitants of hair and clothing, causing a deeper, more pervasive itch that maddened you. The sheer impossibility of escaping them, of ever feeling truly clean or free of these parasites, was a constant, low-level torment. Your modern concept of personal space and hygiene was utterly irrelevant here. You were, simply, host to a multitude of tiny, unwelcome guests. The natural hazards were equally terrifying in their unpredictability. Your modern life had weather forecasts, climate control, and robust infrastructure. Here, the weather was the supreme ruler, dictating everything from your daily tasks to your very survival. A prolonged drought could bake the earth, turning the precious green shoots into brittle straw, condemning your family to hunger in the coming winter. A sudden, violent flood could wash away an entire season's labor, drowning crops and livestock alike. A fierce hailstorm could strip a field bare in minutes. The sky, once a distant, beautiful canvas, was now an ominous, unpredictable entity. Every cloud, every shift in the wind, every unseasonal drop in temperature was watched with bated breath, for it could spell the difference between meager survival and outright starvation. There was no insurance, no government aid, no emergency relief, only the raw, unblinking face of nature, indifferent to your plight. And then, there was the human element of danger, bandits and lawlessness. Your modern society relied on a vast, interconnected network of law enforcement, legal systems, and public safety. Here, the rule of law was tenuous, distant, and often brutal. While the local lord provided a semblance of order, his justice was often arbitrary, and his reach did not extend far beyond his immediate domain. The roads and forests were not always safe. Vague, unsettling tales circulated of marauders, desperate men, often landless or dispossessed soldiers, who preyed on the unwary traveler, or even raided isolated villages. A glint of metal in the distance, a strange sound on the path, a rumor from the next village, each could be a harbinger of violence, robbery, or worse. Your modern sense of security, of being protected by an unseen, omnipresent authority, was utterly absent. You were responsible for your own safety, which often meant simply hoping you went unnoticed, or that a larger, more powerful force wouldn't deem you worth plundering. The vulnerability was chilling, a constant, low-level anxiety that added another layer of weariness to your existence. Finally, there was the all-encompassing, pervasive presence of the feudal lord. He was the ultimate, distant authority, the one who owned the land you toiled on, the one who held the power of life and death over you. You were bound to him by birth, by custom, by a system called feudalism that you now experienced firsthand. Your labor was not for your own profit, but primarily for his. You paid him in crops, in service, in loyalty. His demands were absolute. Work his land, serve in his local militia if called upon, use his mill to grind your grain and pay a fee for it. Use his oven to bake your bread and pay a fee for that too. There was no appeal, no negotiation. His justice was swift and often brutal, meted out in his manor court. A minor infraction could result in severe punishment, a major one in death. There was no concept of innocent until proven guilty in your modern sense, no complex legal counsel. His word was law, and his indifference to your daily suffering was palpable. Your individual aches and pains, your personal struggles, were insignificant in the grand scheme of his domain. You were a unit of labor, a means to an end, a tiny cog in his vast, self-serving machine. This constant, underlying awareness of your subservient place, the unchallengeable authority hovering above you, created a pervasive sense of helplessness. Your modern spirit, accustomed to individual rights, to free will, to the pursuit of personal ambition, felt utterly crushed under the weight of this medieval hierarchy. There was no escape from the Lord's shadow, no way to truly own your labor, your body, or your destiny. As the day wore on, and the hoe continued its repetitive arc, the accumulation of these unseen dangers began to weigh more heavily than the physical exhaustion. The relentless itch of parasites, the anxious glances towards the ominous forest, the chilling awareness of arbitrary power, the constant, low-level hum of anxiety about the weather's caprice. These weren't acute pains, but a pervasive, grinding stress that slowly, relentlessly eroded your spirit. It seeped into your bones, deeper than the damp cold, more insidious than the constant hunger. The vastness of the fields, the unchanging horizon, the rhythmic thud of the hoe, the distant, indistinguishable sounds of other laborers, all merged into a singular, monotonous drone. Your thoughts, initially clear and distinct in their protest, now began to blur, pulled down by the sheer weight of these overwhelming, uncontrollable threats. The details of the harsh reality, the gritty earth, the biting insects, the ever-present threat of scarcity, slowly dissolved into a hazy, indistinct background. Your body, weary beyond anything it had ever known, began to surrender to the heavy, persistent hum of the medieval world, a deep, pervasive weariness that promised, finally, to pull you into a long, dreamless sleep, away from the unglamorous, unrelenting dangers of your medieval day. The sun was now directly overhead, a pale, indifferent disk in the vast sky, marking the approximate midpoint of this seemingly endless day. Your muscles screamed with a dull, persistent ache that had long since surpassed mere discomfort and settled into a deep, pervasive throbbing. Every swing of the hoe, every pull against the stubborn earth, felt like a Herculean effort. Your hands, raw and blistered, trembled slightly with fatigue. Your modern body, so accustomed to ergonomic chairs, regular breaks, and varied tasks, was in full-blown rebellion. Yet, the work continued, only pausing when a faint, almost imperceptible signal rippled through the communal field. It was the sight of the woman of your newfound family, or perhaps another female villager, making her way towards the laborers, carrying a roughly woven basket. This was the signal for the midday meal, a moment of fleeting respite in the relentless cycle of toil. A quiet murmur, a collective sigh of exhaustion, passed through the field. Tools were finally set down with a heavy clatter, and the hunched figures slowly straightened, stretching out their aching backs with grunts and groans. You shuffled towards the designated spot, likely just a patch of slightly less muddy ground at the edge of the field, where the family gathered. There was no clean picnic blanket, no comfortable bench. You simply sank onto the earth, feeling the damp chill seep through your coarse clothing, your weary limbs grateful for any cessation of movement. The meal itself was, predictably, a study in monotony. From the basket, the woman produced more of the stale, hard bread, the same dense, unyielding loaf from breakfast. It was torn into rough pieces and handed around. You chewed slowly, painfully, your jaw aching from the effort required to break it down. It still tasted bland, earthy, and unsatisfying. Its sole purpose was to fill the gnawing emptiness in your stomach, not to delight your palate. Alongside the bread, there might be a portion of lukewarm pottage, perhaps slightly thicker than the morning's gruel, or maybe a few chunks of boiled root vegetables, turnips or carrots, if they'd had a good harvest. These would be unpeeled, unseasoned, and tasting predominantly of the earth from which they came. There were no spices, no sauces, no condiments to elevate the flavor, no salt, no pepper, no hint of anything beyond the raw, fundamental taste of basic sustenance. The lack of fresh fruit, the complete absence of meat, unless it was a rare feast day or a lucky hunt, the deficiency of variety, was a slow, subtle form of torture for your modern, accustomed palate. Every bite was a reminder of what was missing, of the vibrant flavors you took for granted. To drink, again, was the thin, sour ale, served in communal wooden cups. It was warm from sitting in the sun, and offered little refreshment. You swallowed it down, not for enjoyment, but for hydration, the simple act of taking in liquid. The constant, slight bitterness left a film in your mouth that no amount of ale seemed able to wash away. The eating was a quiet affair. There was little conversation, just the soft sounds of chewing, swallowing, and the occasional sigh. Everyone was too physically exhausted, too focused on the grim task of refueling their bodies for the afternoon's labor, to engage in much banter. The shared silence was heavy with collective weariness. There was no personal cutlery. You ate with your hands tearing at the bread, scooping the pottage directly from the communal pot with your spoon. Your hands, already caked with dirt, only became grimier with the sticky residue of the food. This was your briefest of rests, perhaps a mere half an hour, maybe 45 minutes at most. Just enough time for your stomach to be partially filled, for your most screaming muscles to temporarily quieten, for your mind to briefly drift from the immediate physical strain. You might use this time to simply sit, observing the dull, flat expanse of the fields, watching the other peasants slowly chew, their faces etched with the same profound weariness you felt. Some might mend a broken tool with quiet efficiency. Others might simply close their eyes, head bowed, seeking a moment of peace before the inevitable return to toil. There were no modern distractions to fill this small window of respite. No phone to scroll through, no book to read, no music to listen to, no headphones to create a private world. Your mind was left entirely to its own devices, to the oppressive monotony of the landscape, and to the ceaseless, low throb of your aching body. There were no engaging conversations about current events, no lively debates, no personal stories exchanged. The mental landscape was as barren as the fields, offering little to stimulate or entertain. You realized how utterly reliant your modern self was on constant external input, on the endless stream of information and entertainment that shielded you from the stark reality of being alone with your own thoughts, with just the slow passage of time. Here, time stretched, thick and unyielding, broken only by the gnawing physical sensations. The silence of the midday break, though initially a relief from the clang of the hoe, soon became a heavy, profound stillness. Your mind, used to constant stimulation, felt like an engine running idle, craving input it could not receive. The only sounds were the distant buzz of insects, the rustle of dry grass in the wind, and the slow, rhythmic chewing of the other peasants. It was a silence that was less peaceful and more oppressive, a stark reminder of the absence of joy, of intellectual stimulation, of anything beyond the bare necessities of survival. Then, inevitably, came the signal for the call back to work. Perhaps the man of the house would simply rise, a silent command in his weary movements. Or a distant shout from the reeve, the Lord's overseer, would echo across the fields. The brief, fragile bubble of respite burst. With a collective sigh, Bodies groaned into motion once more. Tools were picked up, their weight familiar now, but no less burdensome. The afternoon mirrored the morning's toil with chilling exactness. The same repetitive motions, the same aching muscles, the same unyielding earth. The sun continued its indifferent arc, slowly descending towards the western horizon, promising only more hours of back-breaking labor. The discomforts of the morning, the dirt, the insects, the persistent itch, the biting cold that seeped into your bones, were still present, amplified by the cumulative exhaustion. As you returned to your designated strip of land, the hoe felt even heavier. The earth seemed to resist with even greater stubbornness. The physical pain was a constant companion, but it was the mental exhaustion, the sheer monotony of the tasks, the absolute lack of any novelty or variation that began to truly wear you down. Your modern mind, so used to novelty and rapid change, found itself suffocated by the unchanging rhythm, the endless repetition. The hours dissolved into a blur of identical actions. The dull, rhythmic thud of the hoe became a drone in your ears. The ache in your muscles a constant, heavy pressure. The slow, relentless march of time, broken only by this fleeting, unfulfilling respite, began to blur the edges of your consciousness, drawing you deeper into a heavy, pervasive weariness. The promise of continued, unchanging labor stretched before you, vast and unyielding, slowly, gently, pulling you towards a deep, dreamless sleep, away from the relentless tedium of your medieval day. The seemingly endless afternoon in the arable fields eventually, mercifully, began its slow fade towards evening. Your body, a symphony of aches and protests, was now utterly consumed by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The repetitive thud of the hoe, the constant stooping, the pervasive dampness and chill, had worn you down to a state of near-hypnotic weariness. Yet, even as the immediate physical torment began to subtly lessen with the declining sun, another, more insidious truth of medieval life began to dawn on you. The absolute and crushing lack of specialization in your peasant existence. In your modern life, you existed within a vast, intricate web of specialized skills. Someone designed the clothes you wore, another engineered the phone you used, a third grew and processed your food with industrial precision, a fourth managed the complex financial systems that governed your world. You were a consumer, benefiting from thousands of highly specialized experts working in unison. Here, in medieval England, that luxurious division of labor simply did not exist for someone of your station. As a peasant, your skills were not deep, but incredibly broad. You were a jack of all trades, a master of none, because you had to be. You were, by necessity, a farmer, a builder, a tailor, a cook, a rudimentary veterinarian, a basic carpenter, and a general laborer, all rolled into one exhausted body. You had to know how to mend a fence, how to patch a thatch roof, how to churn butter, if you were lucky enough to own a cow, how to spin rough wool into thread, how to butcher a pig or a chicken, how to sharpen a tool, how to identify edible wild plants, and how to tell the difference between a healthy crop and one succumbing to blight. This wasn't about choosing a career path or developing a unique talent. It was about the brute force necessity of self-sufficiency for survival. The tools you used for these myriad tasks were as rudimentary as the skills themselves. The heavy, crude hoe from the fields was just one example. Back in the hovel, or perhaps in a tiny lean-to shed attached to it, you would find the full complement of a peasant's toolkit. There would be a few simple wooden implements. A flail for threshing grain, its two wooden staves joined by a leather thong, a rake with rough wooden teeth, a spade with a wooden blade, perhaps tipped with a thin, dull strip of iron. The metal tools were few and precious. A hand-forged sickle for harvesting, its blade unpolished and rough. Perhaps a heavy axe for felling small trees, or splitting firewood, its edge often chipped. A crude hammer, a few hand-forged nails, which were incredibly valuable and rarely used unless absolutely necessary. And a rough awl for punching holes in leather. Every single one of these tools was a testament to slow, manual craftsmanship. There was no precision engineering, no mass production. The axe handle might be slightly off balance, the hoe blade unevenly tempered. Using them required immense physical effort and a constant awareness of their limitations. They were prone to breaking, and when they did, they needed to be painstakingly repaired, often by you, with whatever scraps of wood, leather, or reforged metal you could scavenge or acquire. The constant need for repair and maintenance was another never-ending chore. A broken tool meant lost time, lost labor, and potentially lost food. The very concept of mass production was utterly alien. Every single item in your meager possession, from the wooden bowl you ate from to the rough wool tunic on your back, had been made by hand, slowly, laboriously. The thread in your clothes was spun by hand, often by the women of the household using a simple drop spindle, a weighted stick that spun fibers into yarn with agonizing slowness. The cloth was then woven on a basic loom, thread by thread, a process that could take weeks or months for a single length of fabric. The pot in which your pottage was cooked was likely hand-formed from clay and fired in a rudimentary kiln. Nothing was disposable. Everything was cherished, mended, and reused until it literally disintegrated. The value of even the simplest manufactured goods, like a small nail or a decent knife blade, was immense, reflecting the immense human labor required to create it. Your modern mind, accustomed to a world of cheap, abundant, instantly replaceable goods, would find this reality utterly baffling and intensely frustrating. While you, as a peasant, were a generalist by necessity, there were a few rare village craftsmen. These were the true specialists, though their work was still incredibly laborious and lacked any modern precision. The blacksmith was perhaps the most vital. He was the one who could transform raw iron into the precious tools you relied on. The plowshare that cut the earth, the axe head that felled trees, the scythe that harvested grain. His forge would glow dully in a separate smoky hut, the clang of his hammer on the anvil a rhythmic, distant sound. His work was hot, dangerous, and physically brutal, but it was essential. You wouldn't be seeing him often. His services were costly, often paid in grain or labor, and his tools, once acquired, were cared for with a reverence bordering on religious. Then there was the miller, if your village was large enough to boast one. His mill, usually powered by water or wind, was another vital piece of communal infrastructure. He ground your grain into flour, a process you couldn't do efficiently yourself. But his service came at a price, often a portion of the flour itself, known as the miller's toll. You were beholden to him, just as you were beholden to the Lord. The sheer time it took to do anything in this world was a constant, underlying source of fatigue. No quick trip to the store for a new pair of shoes. You might have to spend days collecting hides, tanning them, a foul-smelling, laborious process, and then painstakingly cutting and stitching the leather. No instant repair with a power tool. Every mend was a slow, deliberate hand craft. This pervasive slowness, this constant incremental effort for every single necessity, drained not just your body, but your very will. Your modern mind, wired for efficiency and instant gratification, would find this pace of life excruciatingly boring and profoundly exhausting. As you worked in the field, the sun finally began its descent, casting long, weary shadows across the uneven earth. The air grew colder, dampness seeping back into your bones. The endless toil, the rudimentary tools, the sheer necessity of being everything to yourself, it all combined to create a profound sense of limitation. There was no creative outlet, no specialized passion, no path to individual mastery in the modern sense. You were defined by your physical labor, by your ability to produce the bare necessities of life with crude implements and raw strength. The lack of mental stimulation, the absence of any truly engaging or complex problems to solve beyond the immediate physical ones of survival, began to affect your mind. It was as if your brain, accustomed to constant information and novel challenges, was slowly being starved. The repetitive actions, the unchanging landscape, the monotonous sounds of the field, the dull thud of the hoe, the soft rustle of dry leaves, the occasional far-off bleating of a sheep, all merged into a single droning background noise. Your thoughts, initially resistant and clamoring for a different reality, slowly began to lose their sharp edges, becoming duller, heavier, more indistinct. The sheer monotony, the slow, relentless pace of this existence began to exert a powerful, almost hypnotic effect. The world narrowed to the swing of your arms, the pull of your back, the cold, damp earth beneath your feet. Your consciousness, weighed down by the constant effort and the absolute absence of stimulating variety, began to gently, imperceptibly, drift into a profound and quiet weariness, an almost meditative state, drawing you deeper and deeper into a slumber that promised to erase the relentless tedium of the medieval day. The sun, a tired ember in the western sky, finally dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds in muted, weary hues of gray and faint purple. For a moment, the sheer beauty of the vast, unblemished sky offered a fleeting, almost painful contrast to the relentless drudgery of your day. But the brief aesthetic respite quickly faded, replaced by the chilling bite of the evening air and the overwhelming demand of your aching body. The long, laborious hours in the fields had finally come to an end, but the day's toil was far from over. The long walk home was not the easy, winding-down stroll you might associate with the end of a modern workday. Your muscles, screaming with fatigue, protested with every step. Your feet, raw and blistered from hours of contact with the rough earth and the poorly fitting, crude foot coverings, or perhaps none at all, felt heavy and unresponsive. The path, which had seemed merely uneven in the morning, now felt treacherous in the fading light, studded with unseen stones and puddles of treacherous mud. Each footfall was a conscious effort, a careful negotiation to avoid a stumble or a twisted ankle, injuries that in this world could quickly become life-threatening. As you trudged, bent slightly against the chilling breeze, the air grew thick with the familiar earthy smells of the village, wood smoke, animal dung, and damp soil. The distant sounds of other villagers, similarly making their weary way home, were faint and muffled, a shared silence born of utter exhaustion. There was no cheerful chatter, no recounting of the day's events. Only the rhythmic squelch of mud, the rustle of coarse fabric, and the heavy, ragged sound of your own breathing. Your shoulders, weighed down by the invisible burden of the day's labor, felt permanently hunched. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy with fatigue, a profound, all-encompassing weariness that seemed to pull your very spirit down into the damp earth. Finally, the familiar outline of your hovel emerged from the encroaching twilight, a low, dark lump against the fading sky, its single opening faintly glowing with the resurrected fire within. Stepping over the crude wooden threshold, you were immediately enveloped by the warmer, though still smoky air of the dwelling. But there was no rest to be had, not yet. The never-ending cycle of basic survival immediately reasserted itself with the evening's household chores. First, and perhaps most vital, was the ongoing need for water. The bucket you had struggled with that morning needed to be refilled. This meant another journey, perhaps to the communal well or a nearby stream. It was often a chore delegated to the younger members of the household, but the responsibility was shared by all. Lifting the heavy wooden bucket, still damp and smelling of stagnant water, you would make your way back out into the deepening gloom. The well itself might be a simple hand-dug hole, its sides shored up with rough stones. Hauling the heavy, water-filled bucket back up, hand over hand, rope scraping against rough wood, was another test of your depleted strength. The cold, clear water, though essential, felt painfully cold against your raw hands. This was a task repeated endlessly, day after day, for every drop needed for drinking, cooking, and the meager attempts at washing. It was a monotonous, physically demanding chore that never, ever ceased. Then came the issue of fuel. The small fire in the hearth, your only source of warmth and cooking heat, needed constant feeding. This meant gathering firewood. You might have to venture into the nearby woods, searching for fallen branches, twigs, or small deadwood that could be easily broken and carried. The dry, brittle crack of snapping twigs, the rustle of leaves underfoot, the dimming light in the forest depths, these were the sounds and sights of another ceaseless task. Carrying back a bundle of wood, rough and splintery against your arms, was another testament to the physical demands placed upon you. There was no easy access to pre-cut, delivered firewood here. Every stick was gathered by hand, every ember carefully nursed. The constant need to maintain the fire, to ensure warmth and the ability to cook, was a perpetual, low-level anxiety. Once back in the hovel, the focus shifted to preparing the evening meal. This, again, was a testament to the simplicity and monotony of medieval peasant fare. The ingredients were likely the same as breakfast in midday: more stale bread, perhaps a small portion of whatever pottage had been cooked earlier, or a fresh batch if enough water and grain were available. There might be some wild greens gathered from the edge of the fields, bitter and unappetizing. Everything was cooked over the smoky, inefficient fire in the central hearth. The cooking process itself was slow and laborious. No instant heat, no precise temperature control. You had to constantly adjust the position of the crude clay pot over the embers, blowing on the glowing wood to keep the heat consistent, constantly battling the smoke that billowed into the cramped space. The smell of burning wood mingled with the steam of boiling grains, creating a dense, heavy atmosphere that permeated your hair, your clothes, your very skin. The process was not about culinary delight. It was about basic transformation, making inedible raw grains digestible. The result was sustenance, not pleasure. Each spoonful of the lukewarm, bland pottage was a victory against hunger, but a defeat for your modern palate. Finally, after the meal, came the semblance of family gatherings. There was no elaborate table, just the rough wooden chest serving as a low surface, or simply the packed earth floor around the glowing embers of the hearth. The fire, now tended, cast flickering shadows on the rough walls, providing the only significant source of light in the deepening gloom. Conversation was limited. Everyone was physically exhausted, their minds dulled by the day's continuous labor. Perhaps a few terse words were exchanged about the next day's tasks, or the weather, or a rumor from the distant manor. But mostly, there was a profound, quiet fatigue that settled over everyone. Children too tired to play might huddle close to the warmth of the fire, their small bodies already familiar with the burdens of existence. You sat amongst them, feeling the profound silence of their weariness. There was no evening news, no entertainment to share, no stories to be told beyond the repetitive tales of work and survival. Your modern mind, accustomed to winding down with a Netflix show, a video game, or lively conversation, found this utter lack of external stimulation deeply unsettling. The darkness outside the hovel, vast and absolute, seemed to seep into the very corners of the room, intensifying the sense of quiet and the pervasive exhaustion. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire, the occasional sigh, and the quiet, weary breathing of the family around you. As the last embers glowed, casting their final dancing shadows, the sheer weight of the day began to press down with an almost physical force. The relentless, unending nature of the basic chores, the dull repetition of gathering water and fuel, the unappetizing monotony of the food, and the profound silence of communal exhaustion, it all combined to create a sense of overwhelming tedium. Your modern spirit, accustomed to choice, to leisure, to personalized comfort, felt crushed by the relentless, unchanging demands of this existence. The pervasive smell of smoke, the damp chill in the air, the unyielding hard earth beneath you, every sensation spoke of a life stripped bare, devoid of any modern comfort or joy. The flickering firelight, casting its hypnotic dance on the rough walls, began to blur. The quiet, heavy breathing of the sleeping family members around you, the gentle crackle of the dying fire, and the vast, profound silence of the medieval night outside, all merged into a low, continuous drone. It was a sound that seemed to pull at the very edges of your consciousness, drawing you deeper and deeper into a heavy, inescapable weariness, gently lulling you towards a deep, dreamless sleep, away from the relentless, unyielding demands of your medieval day. The pervasive chill of the medieval night had long since settled over the hovel. The last embers in the hearth had faded to a dull, infrequent glow, casting only the faintest, ghostly shadows that danced with the currents of cold air seeping through the daubed walls and thatched roof. Your modern body, accustomed to thermostat-regulated temperatures and soft, enveloping warmth, now grappled with a constant, insidious dampness and cold that seemed to sink into your very bones. There was no escaping it, not truly. You pulled the rough woolen blanket tighter around you, its scratchy texture a constant, low-level irritation against your skin. This was your sleep arrangement, a stark reality far removed from the plush mattresses and crisp linens of your former life. You lay on a hard, straw-filled pallet, not a mattress. The straw, though providing some minimal insulation from the cold, damp earth floor, was lumpy and unyielding. It rustled and crackled with every shift of your body, a dry, whispering sound that seemed to amplify the silence. Beneath the straw, you could feel the unevenness of the packed dirt, the subtle dips and rises that cradled your protesting limbs in uncomfortable positions. There were no soft pillows, perhaps a crude sack filled with more straw, or simply the crook of your arm, served as a headrest. Your neck and shoulders, already aching from the day's labor, found no true relief. The concept of privacy was utterly non-existent. You were not in your own room, in your own bed, enjoying the solitude of your modern personal space. Instead, you lay just inches from the other members of your newfound family, their quiet snores, rustling movements, and even the sounds of their breathing a constant, intrusive presence. The shared sleeping space, a necessary adaptation for warmth and security in such a small dwelling, meant there was no quiet moment of personal reflection or separation from the constant intimacy of communal living. Your modern need for boundaries, for a space that was uniquely and privately yours, was utterly disregarded. Beyond the physical discomfort of your bed, the absence of personal hygiene products continued to be a profound, unsettling reality. Despite the day's relentless toil and the copious amounts of sweat that had clung to your skin and saturated your rough clothing, there was no possibility of a comforting wash. The very thought of hot water, of lathering soap, of scented shampoos, was a cruel, mocking memory. You were unwashed, and you would remain unwashed. The distinct, pervasive smell of smoke, sweat, and the underlying earthy musk of unwashed bodies clung to you, a constant, unavoidable reminder of your medieval reality. The constant itch, initially a mere annoyance, had now intensified to a maddening, pervasive sensation. It was not just the rough wool. It was the undeniable presence of lice and fleas, tiny, unseen creatures that scuttled and bit, leaving small, raised welts on your skin. You found yourself unconsciously scratching even in the depths of your weariness, a continuous, low-grade torment that robbed you of true comfort. The sensation of tiny legs crawling on your scalp, on your arms, on your legs, was a deeply unsettling violation of your modern bodily autonomy. You yearned for the simple relief of a hot shower, a comb, a bottle of shampoo, but these were luxuries utterly beyond reach, even beyond imagination for the people around you. This perpetual state of being unclean, of carrying these unwanted inhabitants, was a profound psychological burden, eroding your sense of self and dignity. As the hovel remained plunged in near-total darkness, you became acutely aware of the lack of light. Once the sun set, the world became a terrifying, absolute black. The small, smoky fire, when it was burning, provided only a dim, flickering glow, barely illuminating the immediate vicinity of the hearth. For anything beyond that, or once the fire died down, you were reliant on crude oil lamps, shallow dishes of animal fat with a simple wick, or precious, expensive candles made from tallow. Their light was weak, casting dancing shadows that swallowed the corners of the room in impenetrable gloom. This meant that the hours after sunset were largely dedicated to darkness and sleep. There was no reading, no writing, no crafting that required fine detail, no extended conversation. Your activities were utterly tethered to the sun's cycle. The limited hours for any activity not directly tied to daylight, combined with a profound physical exhaustion, meant that once darkness fell, your only true option was to sleep. This enforced idleness in the dark was a profound shift from your modern life, where artificial light extended your productive and leisure hours far into the night. Here, the night was for nothing but rest, or restless tossing in the cold and dark. And the cold, it was a constant, pervasive enemy, especially during the long, damp English winters. The hovel, with its simple wattle and daub walls and thatched roof, offered only minimal insulation. The cold seeped up from the packed earth floor, radiated from the unglazed openings that served as windows, and filtered through the very fabric of the walls. Your only significant source of warmth was the central fire, but its heat was localized and quickly dissipated once the fire died down for the night. You learned quickly that people often slept, huddled together, generating communal body heat, a necessity rather than a comfort. Your modern reliance on central heating, on thick, insulated walls, on thermal blankets, was a pampered luxury utterly unknown here. The constant shiver, the ache in your joints from the cold, the difficulty in ever feeling truly, completely warm, was a persistent, debilitating discomfort. Lying there on your straw pallet, listening to the quiet breathing of the others, feeling the persistent itch and the relentless cold, the cumulative effect of these deprivations began to press down on you. It wasn't one grand, dramatic struggle, but 1,000 tiny, insistent discomforts, each one slowly eroding your modern resilience. The unyielding hardness of your bed, the shame of being perpetually unclean, the maddening irritation of parasites, the terrifying darkness, the inescapable cold, these were the bedrock of medieval peasant existence. Your life, stripped bare of every luxury and comfort you had ever known, was reduced to a brutal, raw simplicity. Your mind, initially recoiling from each new sensory assault, now felt heavy, dull, and profoundly weary. The frantic energy of disbelief had long since drained away, replaced by a slow, pervasive numbness. The subtle sounds of the hovel at night, the rustle of straw as someone shifted, the quiet intake of breath, the distant hoot of an owl from the dark woods outside, the incessant, tiny scratching of unseen creatures within the walls, began to merge into a single, continuous, low hum. This droning background noise, combined with the deep, bone weariness of your body and the relentless, unchanging discomforts, began to exert a powerful, almost hypnotic pull. The vast, cold darkness of the hovel seemed to swell, enveloping your senses, drawing your consciousness deeper and deeper into a profound, heavy, inescapable weariness, gently lulling you towards a deep, dreamless sleep, away from the endless, unyielding reality of life without luxury or comfort. The pervasive chill of the hovel continued to seep into your bones, a constant, dull ache that had become a familiar companion. As the monotonous rhythm of the day, the grueling labor, the sparse food, the constant discomforts pressed on, your mind, though dulled by exhaustion, began to fixate on a new, more terrifying dimension of your medieval existence. The terrifying fragility of life itself, and the brutal absence of any real recourse against illness and injury. In your modern world, a minor cut might warrant a quick clean and a band-aid. A fever might mean a trip to the pharmacy for over-the-counter medicine, or a visit to a doctor for antibiotics. Childbirth was a medical procedure, managed by trained professionals in sterile environments. Here, all such certainties were stripped away, replaced by a chilling vulnerability. A simple cut or scrape, easily acquired from the rough tools or sharp branches in the field, was not a trivial matter. In your modern life, you'd barely notice it. Here, it was a potential gateway to disaster, without proper sanitation, without antiseptics, without antibiotics. Even a small break in the skin was an open invitation for infection. You imagined the throbbing pain, the angry redness spreading, the hot streaks moving up your arm, quickly escalating into a life-threatening fever. A festering wound, left untreated, could lead to gangrene, limb loss, or a slow, agonizing death. The constant fear of such a simple accident, the knowledge that your body was a fragile vessel constantly exposed to pathogens you couldn't see, was a profound source of anxiety. Fevers, the body's basic response to infection, were terrifyingly common and often deadly. Malaria, dysentery, typhus, influenza, all were endemic, often sweeping through villages with devastating force. A headache, a cough, a sudden chill, any of these minor symptoms in your modern life could be a sign of a looming, untreatable catastrophe here. You might lie on your straw pallet, shivering uncontrollably, racked by a burning fever, your mind clouded by delirium, with no access to painkillers, no cooling sponges, no effective medicine. Your family would watch, helpless, their faces etched with fear, waiting for the fever to either break or claim you. And perhaps the most perilous journey a medieval woman could undertake was childbirth. In your modern world, it's a celebrated, though intense, event. Supported by medical expertise, here it was a terrifying gamble. Without sterile instruments, without knowledge of germ theory, without proper understanding of complications, both mother and child faced immense peril. Hemorrhage, infection, prolonged labor, any of these could swiftly lead to death. The cries of a woman in labor in a nearby hovel, heard through the thin walls, would not be sounds of hopeful anticipation, but of deep, primal fear. The incredibly high rates of infant mortality were a heartbreaking reality. You would see babies born, tiny and vulnerable, only for them to succumb within days or weeks to fevers, coughs, or simply wasting away. The constant shadow of loss, the heartbreaking frequency with which young lives were extinguished, would be a profound emotional burden. People learned to mourn quickly, to temper their expectations, to accept loss as an inevitable part of life. Your modern heart, accustomed to safe deliveries and childhood milestones, would be utterly broken by this grim reality. In the face of such overwhelming medical ignorance, people relied on what they knew, superstition and folk remedies. If you fell ill, your family might offer you a strange-smelling herbal concoction brewed from plants whose medicinal properties were only vaguely understood. They might place a charm under your pillow, or hang dried herbs above the door to ward off evil spirits. Prayers to saints were fervent and desperate. You might be bled with a crude knife, or have leeches applied. Based on the medieval understanding of humorous practices more likely to weaken you further than to heal. The absolute lack of scientific understanding meant that every illness was shrouded in a terrifying mist of the unknown, often attributed to bad air, a witch's curse, or divine punishment. The fear that you had somehow offended God, or angered a malevolent spirit, would add a terrifying spiritual dimension to your physical suffering. Your modern mind, so rooted in scientific logic and empirical evidence, would find this blend of helplessness and mystical belief deeply unsettling and profoundly frustrating. Living with constant aches and pains would become your new normal. The relentless physical labor meant a perpetual soreness in your back, your shoulders, your joints. Minor injuries, a strained muscle, a bruised limb would not heal quickly, hampered by malnutrition and constant re-injury. You would simply have to live with the pain, pushing through it, because there was no alternative. There were no painkillers, no anti-inflammatories, no physical therapy. Pain was simply a part of the landscape, a constant companion that reminded you of your physical limitations and the unforgiving demands placed upon your body. The emotional toll of this medical reality was immense. Every cough from a child, every complaint of a stomachache, would send a cold dread through you. You would witness suffering, perhaps even death, without the comforting presence of trained medical professionals or the hope of modern intervention. You would see the despair in the eyes of parents watching their children fade, the stoic acceptance of adults facing incurable ailments. Your modern compassion, accustomed to tangible solutions and the promise of recovery, would feel utterly impotent. As the night deepened, and the distant, unseen sounds of the medieval village settled into a profound stillness, the weight of this existential vulnerability pressed down on you. The images of festering wounds, of feverish bodies, of the desperate hope for a child's survival, played out in the dim recesses of your mind. The pervasive dampness of the hovel, the rough straw beneath you, the faint, lingering smell of wood smoke and sickness, all contributed to a profound sense of unease. Your consciousness, already heavy from the day's toil and the absence of comfort, found itself further weighed down by this chilling fear. The quiet, rhythmic breathing of the family around you, the subtle creaks of the hovel, the distant, mournful hoot of an owl. These sounds, which might otherwise be soothing, now seemed to whisper of the ever-present fragility of life. The rhythmic throb of your own tired body, the subtle aches and pains that permeated your limbs, became a slow, insistent pulse. The fear of what tomorrow might bring, of the unseen illnesses and accidents that could strike without warning or remedy, began to blur into a deep, pervasive weariness. This quiet dread, combined with the relentless monotony of your existence, began to exert a powerful, almost hypnotic pull, drawing your consciousness deeper and deeper into a profound, heavy, inescapable slumber, a temporary escape from the terrifying realities of illness, injury, and the relentless fear of the unknown in medieval England. As the long, arduous day finally faded into the deep, absolute black of the medieval night, a profound, almost crushing realization began to settle over you. It wasn't the sharp shock of discovery from that first abrupt awakening, nor the acute pain of blisters and aching muscles, nor the constant irritation of unseen parasites. It was something far deeper, far more insidious. The chilling truth of the inevitable repetition. You lay on your straw pallet, the rough wool blanket, doing little to ward off the pervasive damp chill that clung to the hovel. Your body, utterly spent, ached in 1,000 places, a dull, persistent throb that had become your constant companion. The faint, earthy smell of the dwelling, a blend of smoke, damp earth, and unwashed bodies, was now so ingrained in your senses that you barely noticed it, yet it was always there, a subtle, inescapable presence. The silence of the night, broken only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of your sleeping family members and the occasional skittering of unseen creatures in the thatch, pressed in, amplifying the stillness of your own weary mind. As you tried to conjure a thought, to grasp onto a memory of your former life, you found your mind strangely dulled. The sharp edges of panic and disbelief had long since worn away, replaced by a profound, pervasive weariness. You understood, with a certainty that chilled you to the bone, that tomorrow would be fundamentally the same as today, and the day after that, and the day after that. The sun would rise, pulling you from your uncomfortable slumber. You would endure the same unwashed mornings, the same bland, coarse bread and watery pottage. You would embark on the same long, muddy walk to the fields, carrying the same heavy, crude tools. You would perform the same back-breaking, repetitive tasks, hoeing, weeding, tilling, sowing, or harvesting, depending on the unforgiving demands of the season. You would be exposed to the same biting winds, the same relentless sun, the same constant dirt and insects. Your midday meal would be the same meager, tasteless fare. consumed in weary silence before the inevitable return to more hours of toil. Evening would bring the same exhausting walk home, the same endless cycle of fetching water and gathering firewood, the same smoky, inefficient cooking of the same monotonous meal, and then the same communal sleeping in the dark, cold hovel, plagued by the persistent itch of parasites and the ever-present threat of illness with no hope of relief. This was the cycle, dictated not by your desires or choices, but by the relentless march of the sun, the turning of the seasons, and the unyielding demands of the feudal lord. There was no escaping its rhythm, no way to break free. The crushing weight of this realization was the absence of escape. In your modern life, if a job was tedious, you could seek another. If a place was unpleasant, you could move. If your life felt stagnant, you could pursue education, new hobbies, or travel, constantly seeking self-improvement and new experiences. Here, there was no such luxury. Social mobility was virtually non-existent for a peasant. You were born into this life, and you would die in it. Your children, if they survived, would inherit the same straw pallet, the same crude tools, the same strips of land, the same subservience to the Lord. There was no path to education, no opportunity to learn to read or write, no chance to explore ideas beyond the practical necessities of survival and the simple teachings of the local priest. Your world was this village, these fields, this endless toil. The boundaries were fixed, immutable, stretching to the horizon and beyond, effectively trapping you in a system that offered no hope of a different future. Your modern spirit, accustomed to the endless possibilities of self-determination, to the very concept of choice, felt utterly suffocated. The knowledge that every day was a mere repetition of the last, with no hope of advancement, no prospect of change, no avenue for personal growth beyond learning to endure the hardship with slightly more stoicism, was a profound psychological burden. It stripped away hope, ambition, and the very essence of what defined you as a modern, striving individual. And yet, as you lay there, exhausted beyond measure, a strange, almost unsettling observation began to take hold. The people around you, your medieval family and neighbors, seemed to possess a profound, weary acceptance of this reality. They did not rail against their fate. They did not seem consumed by bitterness or despair. They moved through their days with a quiet endurance, a deep resilience that was born not of choice, but of absolute necessity. They found simple joys, a good harvest, a healthy child, a rare feast day, the warmth of the fire on a cold night, the shared burden of community. Their lives were hard, brutal even, but they found meaning in the cycle itself, in the rhythm of the seasons, in the continuity of their lineage. This was their existence, and they lived it, unblinkingly. Your modern desire for constant happiness and fulfillment felt frivolous, almost absurd, in the face of their quiet, profound endurance. As your mind slowly, inevitably began to succumb to the overwhelming fatigue, this realization about their quiet acceptance began to exert a peculiar, soothing effect. The sharp edges of your own protest, your constant comparison to a lost world, began to soften. The sounds of the hovel at night, the steady, quiet breathing of the sleeping family, the almost imperceptible rustle of straw, the gentle, rhythmic crackle of the last embers in the hearth began to blur into a soft, continuous drone. The details of the harsh reality, the aching body, the constant cold, the looming threat of disease, seemed to fade into the background, becoming distant echoes in your consciousness. The very rhythm of the story itself, mirroring the slow, deliberate, unchanging pace of medieval life, began to exert a hypnotic influence. The repetition of the daily cycle, the quiet description of each mundane yet exhausting task, the steady, unvarying tone, all converged into a gentle, persistent lullaby. Your thoughts, once racing with anxiety and disbelief, now slowed, became heavy, like stones sinking into a deep, still pool. the boundaries between waking and sleeping blurred, the harsh reality of the medieval world dissolving into a soft, indistinct haze. You felt your eyelids grow heavy, your breath deepen, your body finally surrendering to the profound, bone-deep weariness, the quiet hum of the medieval night, the gentle rhythm of collective sleep, the subtle sway of the hovel in the unseen wind, all merged into a single, continuous, comforting sound. The cycle would continue tomorrow, endless and unchanging, but for now, for this moment, you were finally drifting, pulled down, gently, completely, into a deep, dreamless sleep, away from the relentless, unyielding demands of a life where you wouldn't last a day. The soft darkness of the hovel wrapped around you, a final, quiet embrace as you slipped into profound, oblivious rest. And now, dear listener, if your eyes have grown heavy, may sleep find you gently. If you're still awake, may the hush of history linger a little longer. Until next time, rest well and dream in whispers.